Hello, this is Kenneth Brashears here again, and I am moving on from my brief history of the text of the New Testament. And today I'm only doing a screen capture because I'm piddling around with a few different software applications for screen recording and whatnot. And apparently, for Adobe Presenter, you have to have an extremely nice camera. That's a little on the expensive side, and I'm dirt cheap. So I'm still messing around with that kind of stuff to see what I am going to like to use. But anyways, I wanted to take some time to respond to an article here. Now, this is an article by on Faithful Word Baptist Church's website. So Stephen Anderson and the new Independent Fundamental Baptist Individuals. And one of the reasons I wanted to respond to it was because there was a there was a pastor out in California roughly 3 or so years ago who made national headlines when he commented on the Orlando, Florida, or the Florida gay bar shooting, saying that he wished that the shooter would have been able to get more or kill all of them or what have you. And one of the, I don't know if you can call it tenets, but one of the major doctrines that this group ascribes to is an odd form of reprobate doctrine. Now, in my opinion, now I'm not a Calvinist. I do have many Calvinist friends, and I agree with them on various things. I disagree with them on various things. I get along really well, even though sometimes I may try to push the issue. But anyways, the only way that a form of reprobate, when in the terms of rejection, that seems to make sense to me, would be in the deterministic Calvinistic sense, as in God accepted some for salvation, rejected the others for damnation. But this particular form of this doctrine is odd, and it relies upon unusual exegesis, but also they make a couple of mistakes when the translation that the King James Bible renders, they don't look at the Hebrew and Greek that's behind these words, and so that's what I want to look at here. So number one, we have some faulty exegesis, anyways. But number two, it almost seems their form of King James onlyism doesn't even care about what the Greek or Hebrew has to say. So you could ask the question, is there anything about Greek and Hebrew that we can continue to learn beyond what the translators in 1611 were able to translate, or is there the be all and end all? There's no way we can learn more about these words. And so I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm going to go. I'm not going to answer everything on this article or on this posting because a lot of it is just doesn't seem to follow, but it's also primarily based upon the few points that I'm going to make or that I'm going to address. And once you've just proved those, the rest of it will just seem to fall apart in and of itself. So, to get started here, let me open this up. Considering, yes, I still use eSword because I'm cheap. I'm going to get Logos eventually. I'm going to get one of the, I don't know if I want to get the $50 or the $200 setup. But, anyways, let's, ooh, yes, this will be important. So, anyways, number one, we'll start with, can sodomites be saved? So basically, he immediately quotes Leviticus 20. If a man lies with mankind as he lies with woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. So this is no Levitical law for this. So can sodomites be saved? So let's go through this. Homosexuality is totally unnatural behavior. I agree, but sin in and of itself, anything that is not of God, I would also consider unnatural behavior. Lying should be unnatural behavior. According to the Bible, every one of us is born with a sin nature. Yes, we are. I agree. We have a natural tendency to sin. For example, children not even tell a lie. So, going on, it says a normal man is not even tempted with homosexuality at all. Now, I would have a problem with this statement. The issue here is it seems as though, in my opinion, others can disagree, but if you look at American culture since the beginning of since the beginning of our country, and even in the Christianized Western society, this was essentially taboo, just as many other forms of relationships and inappropriate things were taboo. This wasn't just seen as immoral, it was seen as grotesque. And it wasn't until the last 30 to 40 years that our society has even come to accept anything outside of marriage between a man and a woman. And now, of course, we have all the issues with various forms of polyamory going around, but why can't a person marry a family member or have multiple spouses all at once? But anyways, the thought of homosexuality to a normal man is disgusting and repulsive. Now, again, that is primarily based on our culture, in my opinion. A process must take place before a person can become so perverted to desire a relationship with the same gender. Now, he's going to refer to the degradation of society that's explained in Romans 1. And this is where we start also getting into some textual problems with their exegesis. As a matter of fact, let me just go ahead for the sake of time, and I'll go ahead and I'll use the King James translation because it's amazing you can actually use it and refute this, even though they're King James onlyists. So we would probably agree that down to verse 17 is basically the introduction of Paul's letter to Rome, and then he begins this discourse. If we look at Romans, if we look at the Bible in general, if you went back and you looked at or watched my videos on the history of the text in the New Testament, I stated eventually, I believe it was in the third video, that the chapter and verse divisions are a great tool, but they can be a hindrance because there was no methodology to how the chapter and verse system was put on in 1551 by Stephanus. It was implemented onto the text as a tool, and it was 1571 for the Old Testament. But it's a great tool, and I don't knock it at all. But you have to understand, when you study, you have to study thought to thought, paragraph to paragraph. You can't study chapter and verse. We read chapter and verse, but you must study. When a pastor is going through the text, preparing his sermons, in my opinion, he should go thought for thought, paragraph for paragraph, unless there's a little short tidbit that he's gonna extract some necessary truth from for that time being. But anyways, as you're going expositorily through the text, you have to study paragraph to paragraph. If the book of Romans, the letter of Romans, was written as a modern day narrative, as a modern day book, chapter 1 would be Romans 1:18 all the way probably to the end of chapter 3. Because, to put it simplistically, from Romans 1 to Romans 3, we conclude all men are under sin, and we conclude that justification is by faith. That is the whole basic point that Paul is getting to. Now, when Romans 1:18 starts, we start with the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So all of men. And basically, most of your expositors will look at this and apply this to the Gentile nations throughout history. And that would make sense, especially when you go to chapter 2, and he immediately flips over to the moralist. And then later on, you will find in Romans chapter 2 that he flips over to the Jew. in chapter 3, he concludes with all that we conclude all under sin, and then we conclude justification is by faith. So basically, you look at Romans 1, and you look at this first section of this discourse. He says, verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to them. So all men know of God's existence. God has revealed himself in the creation and our conscience and various other things. It says the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. All men are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they did not glorify, or they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now that the darkening of the heart, that is the many people talk about your conscience being seared with a hot iron. And once you sin once, and then it becomes easier the second time, and the third and fourth and fifth time to commit that sin, and it becomes a problem. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. Well, Gentile nations throughout history, and even Israel, if you go back and you look, it was easier to go down that path. So Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man, birds, four-footed beasts, creeping things. You look at the idolatry of various nations throughout history. So, wherefore God also gave them up. Now, this is a phrase, paradidomai, or paradidomi. I'm not a Greek scholar here, but I try. God gave them up. Now, paradidomi, in this sense, just means to let go. Let go. So he says, they get hung up on this term here. So to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, change the truth of God into a lie, worship serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this God gave them up to vile afflictions. Again, or affections, excuse me. Paradidomi. He just let them go. He gave them up. He said, you're going to go your own way and keep going. And so, for even their women to change the natural use into that which is against nature, likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, referring to homosexual acts, receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. Modern English, they reap what they sowed, if you will. The natural consequence of these actions was appropriate. So the things that they suffered over time, the things that all these nations and all these societies suffered over time, whether it was God's direct hand of judgment or if it was just the natural consequence of sin. You know, sometimes when a child disobeys and they get hurt for their disobedience, the natural consequence, you kind of learns their they learn their lesson that way. In the army, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, or the 1611 reprint that I have says acknowledge God, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Now this is where they get hung up. A reprobate mind. As a matter of fact, we will see. Get rid of that. As a matter of fact, I don't know why that's there. So again, God gave, see, you talk about God giving them over as in God actively rejecting, or that just means God passively just letting them go. So it's interesting here too. They highlight in bold. They put in bold murder, haters of God, without natural affection, worthy of death, and they pick some. It seems like they cherry pick some of these things. And they call this the attributes of the sodomite. So he's saying the sodomite should be all these right here are the attribute of the sodomite, and that's just not what it's saying at all. But anyways, let's get back to this word reprobate, used 128. So the first time it's ever mentioned in the Bible is Jeremiah 6:30. Reprobate silver shall man call them, because the Lord hath rejected them. So now reprobate silver. Okay, so reprobate is being used as I don't know why they're using this here, because it's used as an adjective, and you can actually go to probably the best dictionary for that era of English that you're going to find, which is fortunately 200 years removed. But when the word reprobate, this is the 1828 dictionary, is used as an adjective, it says not enduring proof or trial, not standing purity or fineness, disallowed, rejected, such as Jeremiah 6:30. Now, of course, in this case, you could think of, if you remember, pennies used to be made more of copper, and now they're using more zinc and nickel. If you were to compare one to the other, the modern day penny would be reprobate, as in not withstanding the test of purity, or you could say I've refined gold, but something happened to it to where it is not as refined as it should be, or it's of a lesser quality. That's basically what this means here, and therefore it ends up rejected. There are other various uses of this word, whether it's used as a verb. Now, when used as a verb, it means to actively reject. So this word reprobate. Now, in the Greek, and this is where they get hung up on this. In the Greek, this word is adikimos. So the word reprobate used in Romans 1:28, and I will pull it up here to make sure that everyone can see it. God gave them over to a reprobate. That means adikimos. And again, how is this word being used? Well, for one, it's being used as an adjective. It's not being used as a verb. Now, this is paradidomi, which means to give up, to let go, to just, it's got various methods of translation, but when you just read it, you just naturally read it. God let them go, because what? God rejected them to a rejected mind? That doesn't seem to make sense. God let them go, gave them over to a reprobate, or probably a more accurate translation for today's setting, the word debased. It is a mind of lesser quality. It is a depraved mind. Because again, the silver, reprobate silver in Jeremiah 6:30. Well, what kind of silver? It's reprobate. It is debased, devalued, not of purity. It's less pure silver, or it's less than pure silver. So what does that mean? It's debased. It's been brought down in its value. Well, that's what that word adikimos is referring to. It is a mind that has been debased, it's been depraved, it's been lowered. And that was exactly what was in the mind of the King James translators, because you can go to their notes. I don't have it here on, because I don't have the camera on here, but if you go to their note, on their footnote, and again, I've expressed my frustration with King James Bibles that are published today, because unless you get a really good study Bible, you're not going to get any of these notes. I really wish they would have taken the translator's notes and put them in the margins. And not saying you can't use that today. It's good if you want to use it, but in the translation notes for Romans 1:28, when it comes to that word reprobate, it'll say, or a mind void of judgment. And you can go to the Geneva Bible translators, you can go to John Wesley's commentaries, you can go to Charles Spurgeon's commentary, you can go to basically any reputable commentary of this passage, and they all basically say the same thing about, in regards to this phrase right here, that God gave them over to a mind void of judgment is another way to say it. It's probably a more accurate way to say it in today's language. Anyways, that's what I wanted to get to. So, number one, they are getting confused about how this word is used. Basically, this word does not mean rejected, because again, reprobate is the word that we're looking at. Now, in this phrase in Jeremiah 6:30, the Lord hath rejected them Now that is in the active sense. The Lord is performing, the noun, the subject, is performing the action upon the object. So that's in the active sense. So, but this word reprobate is being used as an adjective. And as an adjective, it basically means debased, depraved, of lower value, silver of lower value, or however you want to put it. That's what that word means, and that's the same thing in Romans 1:28. So, let's continue on. I'm not really going to deal with this particular, because this is basically, it says every sodomite in the Bible was a rapist or molester. Now, you have to understand, when it came to Canaanite, again, the issues in the land of Canaan, you're primarily dealing with an entire culture that is centered around various forms of, basically various forms of sexual deviancies. You can go and read about the Canaanite religions and how their fertility gods and goddesses and their practices and how they did all that. And that's actually going to come into play as in this next example. But anyways, this is a massive assumption that let's just say every sodomite in the Bible was a rapist or molester. Does that mean that they're all today? See, that is a direct correlation that just does not follow, because you have to take into account this little thing called context. So, example 3, now this is what I wanted to get to, because this is a clear indication, or a clear example, as clear an example as I could probably give, in how they don't care about the Hebrew underlying the text. It's, they'll talk about, we believe the Masoretic text, then the 1525 Bomberg text, and the Textus Receptus are the preserved texts, is what they'll say. Well, they don't really care about the underlying languages, because here's the thing. The King James translators and various others, such as the Geneva Bible and a few others, and those that use the King James as their underlying text, because even the ASV and the ERV, I believe, still use it. So when we're referencing the word sodomite, translated sodomites in 1 Kings 14:24, 1 Kings 15:12, 1 Kings 22:46, and 2 Kings 23:7, all of these words, we can go through them. As a matter of fact, I'll go ahead and pull it up. So 1 Kings 14:24. Let's get up here real quick. 14. So 14:24, right here. So and there were also sodomites in the land. Now the term translated sodomite. Now, depending on what point in history of English you want to go to, because again, the English language wasn't necessarily standardized, and really until around the time of Webster's 1828 dictionary. I mean, that's really the first dictionary one of the first dictionaries you can go to really get information about words of the English language for this time. But this was basically a general term. The term sodomite or buggery is another term that was used in a legal sense. So this right here, though it often meant males with males, it could have been committed with male to female as well. Anything that was considered unnatural, any sexual act that was considered unnatural was sodomy. Now, this particular word in Hebrew is kadesh. There's kadesh, kadeshim for plural, kadeshah for feminine. And in 1 Kings 14:24, as well as, let's see here, let's go to 15:12, kadesh, 22:46. So we can go to, and just because I want to make sure we cover it here, Kadesh, And 2 Kings 23. Anyways, we can do that one later. But anyways, I'll go back to the original one here. Well, over the last 2 centuries, really, our knowledge of Hebrew, scholarly knowledge of Hebrew, has just exploded compared to the time of the Reformation and the 1600s. Now, in my history of the text in the New Testament, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but I did mention Desiderius Erasmus. For the Book of Revelation, he used Johannes Reuchlin's manuscript or commentary, really. And Johannes Reuchlin was an interesting individual, and God used him mightily because he wrote the first Hebrew grammar for Christians in the West. Why is that important? Well, it's important because, one, he risked his life to do it. If you got caught consorting with Jewish rabbis, who are the only ones that were going to teach you Hebrew, you were going to get your life cut pretty short. And you had the Vulgate. Why do you need that? Why do you need to know Hebrew? Well, so the West's understanding of Hebrew really began around the beginning of the Reformation, and it was still developing even after the King James translators. It still kept developing. They relied a lot upon the Latin to get them through the Hebrew, especially the Hebrew language, but as well as the Greek language. But anyways, this term over the last while, you can go to any reputable lexicon, Hebrew dictionary. You can go to, those who actually know Hebrew. You can go to Jewish individuals. But anyways, the word Kadesh, believe it or not, is actually specifically referencing temple prostitution. If you look at the context of each of these, one of the main issues with the idolatrous practices of the Canaanites that God told his people to stay away from was, or one of the reasons he told them to do not bring them into your culture, you don't intermarry with them, you don't do anything, you drive them out of the land or subject them, was they had this odd practice of, you had a male temple, or you had the male priest, which represented one god. Then you had the female priestess, who represented the goddess, and it was about fertility. I believe it was Asherah and Baal. But anyways, and they would come together, and it was some ritual about fertility of the land and of the people and all that. But anyways, there's a lot that goes into that. But anyways, that was one of the practice, was basically ritualistic sexual practices. And the term Kadesh, as we have found out over the last while, that's what this was referring to. So this isn't referring to homosexuality, although it can be, that was a practice. This was referring to sexual deviancies as practiced by the Canaanite religion, as those who practiced the Canaanite religion. And this was something that various Jews got, Israelites who were called of God to live separate from the rest of the world around them, they fell into this in the times of the split kingdom and whatnot. And this is what God was telling them not to do. You didn't have to tell them about it. But anyways, I can keep going on and on and on with that. So anyways, not only do we have a misapplication of paradidomi, God gave them up, a misapplication or a misunderstanding of the word reprobate as it's used in the King James translation in Romans 1:28, even though the translation note gives a clear intent of what they meant, and a very great misunderstanding of the term translated sodomite by various translations. But when you actually look at the underlying Hebrew, in these 4 places do not reference homosexuality directly, but the Canaanite temple practices. Although you can go back to Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, and various other places in the Old and New Testament where they, excuse me, where that is referenced. What's interesting in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 and 10, where he uses in the King James, it's abuses, effeminate, abuses of themselves of mankind, or basically homosexuals. Paul utilizes two words and he puts them together and kind of coins a word, and those two words, arsenokoitai, which Paul derives from the Greek Septuagint in Leviticus 18 and 20. But anyways, now we're going to get to the epilogue of why he hates homosexuals. And he says, because homosexuals hate God. Well, it's funny. I don't think you have to be that in order to hate God. Atheists and various others, even agnostics, or people who believe in God but they're not Christian, so they're not atheist, but they're theistic, but they're just not Christian. I know of plenty of them that hate God. And what's interesting, and this is where the odd exegesis comes in, he basically picks these people out in this entire list, when this list is basically a general description of every Gentile society throughout history in the pattern that they have followed, and even the pattern that the U.S. could be following. And so, being filled with all unrighteousness, well, here's the thing. If anybody in your and here's the thing I'm going to get to, is they that which commit such things are worthy of death, and not only do the same but have pleasure in them that do them. Okay, anybody who is filled with unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, and they can look in their own congregation. Has anybody been guilty of covetousness? Oh, I'm pretty sure we all have. And guess what? We're worthy of death. How about maliciousness? How about envy? Murder. Jesus said if you hate someone, you're a murderer. Debate. Deceit. Has anybody in your congregation ever lied? And I'm not saying, hey, how do you like my hair? And, oh, it looks great, but not really. No, I'm talking about deception. How about those who stir up strife? You've got debate, malignity, whisperers, gossips, are worthy of death. Backbiters, worthy of death. Haters of God, despiteful, proud boasters. So those who are haughty and are boasters are worthy of death. Inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. If you have a rebellious child, let's say have any of you have ever had a rebellious 15 or 16-year-old? Guess what? That child is worthy of death. Without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, basically astorgos, that's the natural love that should come, typically familial love, implacable, unmerciful. So basically you're saying, if you're going to put homosexuals that the government should be rising up and putting them to death, you should also say that the government should put all these other people to death, including those people who may be professing believers and in your own very congregation. This is where odd exegesis and basically a desire to withhold a particular type of tradition can completely skew your thinking into holding to a form of doctrine that you just, if you really put it up to scrutiny, God says, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, and that's Old Testament. God calls all men everywhere to repent, and on top of that, you also have to assume that in 1 Corinthians 6, now anybody who knows of the Church of Corinth, who has ever read about the city of ancient Corinth and knows about their practices and all the crazy stuff that went on, basically in Greco-Roman society, the only relationship that was taboo was incestual relationship. And it's funny that in chapter 5, that was one thing the church was being accused of, or it was reported of. But anyways, he says, do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, effeminate, abusers of themselves of mankind. So the basically arsenokoitai, basically the passive and the active partner of of homosexuality, so referring to the temple practices of Apollo and Aphrodite. So, well, of Apollo because it's masculine. But anyways, thieves, covetous, drunkards, revilers, extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. But now here's an interesting little statement. And he says, and such were some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. So some of you, hey, you know what? Some of you were at those temples, right? Some of you were fornicators at those temples. Some of you were idolaters. You did not believe in God, or you did not worship the one true God. Some of you were adulterers, because some of you were married and still in those practices at your pagan temples. Some of you were effeminate. Some of you were the temple prostitutes for Apollo. Some of you, you could also apply it for Aphrodite. Some of you were homosexuals. Some of you were thieves. Some of you were covetous. Some of you were drunkards, revilers, extortioners. But he says, but you were washed, sanctified, and justified. So now they'll say, well, these are the people that would judge them if they went to lawsuit against believers. Even if. He says, such were some of you. You don't have to deal with this. You have to deal with this. Because what's the antecedent to this that he's referring to? All of this right here. So in conclusion, for one, you'll hear the NIFB say the Hebrew text that underlies the King James Old Testament, which really there isn't much debate. That's basically, they all basically use the same resources for the Old Testament. Some expanded out to other things, and then they'll say the TR of the New Testament. Now, though they say TR, I really don't believe that's what they mean, because if you say TR, you know that if they pull out an 1894 Scrivener text, that's not the quote-unquote TR. There's about 30 different texts that you could call the Textus Receptus. And the Textus Receptus was actually coined in 1633, 22 years after the initial publishing. So go back and view my brief history of the text of the New Testament. I say brief. There's almost 2 hours worth of stuff there. But anyways, it gives you a foundation. But anyways, this is what I wanted to get to, because I ran across a video of the California pastor saying those things, and he gets put up by CNN, MSNBC, ABC as this is what Christians believe and this represents Christianity, and it doesn't. Now, I will end this by saying, here's the deal. Homosexuality is a sin. Anything that is outside the prescription of marriage that God gave. What did Jesus say? Even when he was questioning the divorce, he basically settled the whole matter. He said, have you not read that which he which made them in the beginning made them male and female? For this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Obviously, that settles the matter. Anything that does not fall within that prescription falls under adultery. Jesus said, if you even look with lust, you've committed adultery already. So anybody who watches this, is listening to this, I would say, please don't fall into this trap. Every sinner is worthy of death. Now, I'm not saying that I would be okay with governments abolishing the death penalty. But I think in our context, in our day, because we got to remember we're unfortunately operating in the world and with worldly governments, and probably the most inefficient thing mankind could ever create was a government. But anyways, Christians have spanned throughout time, throughout cultures, and various governments have had to deal with different things. And our number one focus is evangelism and discipleship. If we work within the government, I believe we should work to institute as godly things as we can and seek to further the kingdom. But when it comes to this particular issue right here, Paul is not saying that the government should rise up and kill these people. Paul was under a government that he said to be submissive to, that was terrorizing Christians until about 313. So again, bad exegesis of the text, a basically a misleading claim to the text underlying their English text, and basically not looking into basically the knowledge that we have discovered of the language of that underlying text has basically produced this. So any comments, questions, complaints, concerns, critiques, put them in the comments, hit like, subscribe, and you'll be able to keep up with what I am doing and posting. Thank you, and God bless.